Well, thank you very, very much indeed. We are going to talk to you tonight about the power of podcasting. And we're going to talk to you about the who, the what, and the why of podcasting. I am Julian Illman.
And I'm Catherine Bryant. So we're here, we're really pleased to be here to talk about one of our favourite subjects, podcasting. And what we want to do tonight is talk about what podcasting is, why we think it might be good for your business, you and your business, and a little bit about how you do it, or at least there's some quick basics. If by the end of tonight you think, yeah, that might be for me, I might be interested in doing that, we'll give you some sort of pointers to get you started, and at least give you some questions to ask. And we'll be really happy to take questions at the end if you want to just make a note of any that you've got as we go.
First of all, we ought to say, who are these shady characters who you see before you?
Anyway, this is us.
So this is, firstly, we ought to talk about the who we are. As we said, my name is Julian Illman, and this is my other half, Catherine Bryant. We are a husband and wife partnership, although Catherine, for some strange reason, didn't want the name Illman. I have no idea why she would do that. We've been in business and education for around about 35 years between the two of us. Most of the time I've been involved in teaching. I was a lecturer at Suffolk New College, and then took a number of breaks out of that to do various projects, and I worked for 5 years at University Campus Suffolk.
Yeah, and I've also been involved after starting out doing things like running pubs and having a shop and loads of different jobs like that. I ended up in education and training as well, and I did actually also work at Suffolk College, but then I went to something called the Learning and Skills Council, which was a government agency funding post-16 education and training, and I worked with them and basically ended up as a civil servant for 10 years. So there came a point where we wanted to break free from what we were doing for various reasons, and so we decided we were going to set up this website called brilliantliving.hq.com.
And Brilliant Living essentially provides tools, techniques and tips to basically help you take charge of your life, make change happen in your life, achieve your goals and aspirations, and hopefully along the way live a life you love. We're not going to do any more plugs than that, but essentially we focus on mind management products, so they're usually downloadable products. We've got stuff around goal setting, visualization, affirmations and meditation products.
And there is a reason for explaining all this, don't worry. So one of the things we wanted to do was bring this all together, the sort of things that we do on our website. And so I wrote this book called Changeability, Manage Your Mind, Change Your Life last year, available on Amazon in paperback or on Kindle. And one of the things we did is like draw all these things. So like we said, we talk about things like meditation, mindfulness, affirmations, all this. And what I wanted to do was bring them all together into like a coherent framework and show how they all fit together. And that's basically what the book is. It's like a 10-step framework. But one of the things we then thought is, well, we've been thinking about maybe having a podcast for Brilliant Living HQ, but it seemed like a very, very wide sort of big thing to do. So when I wrote the book, we thought, why don't we make that the subject of a podcast? We can try it out, see if we like it. We sort of thought that what would happen would be that because there's 10 steps and we've got some theory at the beginning and then some bits at the end, probably in about 20 episodes we could cover the whole book. And so what happened was we started that about 15 months ago, and actually we're now episode 69 and we're still going. And the whole podcast thing has just sort of taken on a whole life of its own. I mean, it still is called Changeability, and it still sort of links the stuff in the book, but we also talk about a lot of other things as well. And we sort of found out that we actually did quite like podcasting, well, we like it a lot, and that, you know, some other people seem to like our podcast as well, which helps.
So this was us when we started to promote the book initially. This was like 15 months ago. And when you first launch a podcast, one of the first opportunities which you have a while where you can go into new and noteworthy, which is a very highly visible point on iTunes. If you go to iTunes and you go to the podcasting section, you will see that there's a new and noteworthy section at the very, very top. And we were very, very lucky with our podcast that when we launched it, we managed to get to number 1 in 4 categories. You can see some arrows which point along the way. We became also the top podcast down the bottom there, you can see. We had 2, actually at one stage we felt a little bit like the Beatles. We had 3 episodes in the top 10. And I particularly like this slide for two reasons. If any of you know anything about personal development, we are actually above the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is a massive book. We're also above Tony Robbins, who wrote Awaken the Giant Within, who is probably one of the biggest names in personal development. And my favourite of all, which comes in at number 4, We Beat Sex, Hypnosis and NLP. It's probably the only time that changeability has been better than sex. So that's where we were.
I like that one next to it, which is called Bang Radio. I mean, you can just, and I think it is what you think it might be as well.
So that was when we first started. That was when we first started out. And then, well, just about a month or so ago. Do you want to head to the next stage?
So this was probably about 2 or 3 months after we started. And then, this was, as Sam's already mentioned it, but then in September, we found ourselves winning this award, which was fantastic. We won the award for Best Self-Help Podcast at the first ever UK Podcasters Awards, which were held in Manchester in this big sort of lovely ceremony and everything, which was really fantastic. But the best thing about winning this award was that it was actually done on a public vote and on a panel of experts. So it was a combination. So it actually meant people actually went to the trouble of voting for us online, which was fantastic. And as you can see from this, Julian was rather pleased about the whole thing.
I said we were concerned with mind management. Well, you can actually see a fairly good example of me levitating in this next particular one. That's me on stage. Somebody managed to capture me mid-jump as I was hooting with, like, the success of the evening.
Yeah, I'm just about to do our acceptance speech. It was like that. It was really funny. Anyway, so that was then. And then a couple of months, this is sort of like the last bit of our podcasting thing before we get on to the business side. I launched this new podcast called Podcast Divas. And the idea of Podcast Divas is that it's, my strapline is like putting fabulous female podcasters in the spotlight. And so what I do is I interview other female podcasters and also some sort of podcasting experts about things. I'm only 8 episodes in at the moment, so it's still really new, but fortunately it's doing quite well. It's, once again, this is in the podcasting category, and this has been this was last week, but I looked today, I thought I'd better check, and it is still up there in New and Noteworthy. So I'm really pleased with how that's going. And the reason why I'm focusing on women podcasters, for anyone who's interested, especially any of the women, is that there's a massive discrepancy, maybe not surprisingly, between the number of men who are into podcasting and the number of women. I mean, massive. It's about 85 to 15%. So there are a lot more women getting into it now, but there's, we've got to do more.
Space. So before we move on, that's a little bit about us. We want to just do a little bit of a what about you? First of all, I'd like to ask you just a few simple shows of hand. How many of you have got a blog? Could you just raise your hands if you've got a blog? So quite a significant number within the room there. Just sort of make a mental note of this amongst yourselves. How many of you have listened to a podcast? Okay, again, a fair number of people. That's brilliant, excellent. How many of you have a podcast? 1, 2. Fantastic. Okay, so you can see that. Just again, make a little note of that. How many haven't got a clue about podcasts? Just turned up with the free biscuits and the coffee. Lovely. So this is also aimed at you as well along the way. Who the hell didn't put their hand up because they couldn't even be bothered? Okay, we'll just check that out.
Okay, so we're going to start with the what. Now, obviously, most of you know this by the look of it because a lot of people did put up their hands, but just for the people who don't necessarily know what it is, what is a podcast?
So a podcast here is the official definition. A podcast is a digital audio file made available on the internet for downloading to a computer or portable media player like your iPhone or your Android or your iPod, that sort of thing. Typically available as a series, so you can download a series of files like the Changeability podcast, for example, new instalments of which can be received. If you go to the iTunes store, you'll see all these podcasts. If you like one in particular and you start listening to it and you think, yeah, I'm really interested in this, I'd like to receive this all the time, you can subscribe to it and then it will automatically download it to you. The verb to podcast is to make a digital audio file available for podcast.
I like thinking of it as a radio program on demand. If I'm talking to someone, they don't have a clue what you're talking about when you talk about podcasts, which actually does happen quite a lot, maybe surprisingly often, then that's how I normally describe it.
A very brief history of podcasting. The first mention of podcasting was in 2004 by a gentleman called Ben Hammersley from The Guardian, although audiophiles and internet audio was around a little bit before that, but that was the first mention of the word podcasting. Podcasting, just for interest's sake, is what they call a portmanteau. It's the combination of two or more words to make a single word. So it comes from broadcast, the casting bit, and pod, on the proliferation of devices which were used to listen to it in the early days, the popularity of the iPod, hence the term podcast. The real breakthrough for podcasting came through with the introduction of the iTunes directory, which enabled you to search for podcasts, and then the facility for you to have on your phone, in particular initially on Apple phones, an iTunes app for listening to podcasts, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Android, for those of you who are Androids, we don't like to leave those people out. Android apps are available which will do the same thing. For example, there's an app called Stitcher, and there's also some streaming services. Our podcast is available on a thing called TuneIn, which is like an on-demand radio station.
And obviously it's also available on Stitcher and iTunes.
And also, yeah.
So a few quick facts and statistics about podcasting. Does anybody know what the most popular podcast in the world is? Serial, and hence the name. And it's from the stable of This American Life, which previously was the most popular podcast, and it's got very high production values. It's spent a lot of money on it, threw everything at it, and there's going to be a new one coming out very shortly. So the next one is Julian Suffolk with surprise.
Yeah,
so this is just some facts to give you an idea. Unfortunately, most of them relate to the States because that's where the research has been done by a company called Edison. And these, so these are about the United States, but they're still interesting. So basically, 33% of Americans have listened to at least one podcast. That's like ever. And 17% is within like the last 30 days. And these stats are from January this year.
That's up from 9% in 2008, so that's quite a significant interest. And as far as the total number of podcasts, the percentage of Americans who are aware of podcasts, 49%, so about 50% of people are aware. That's probably not far off what we had within this room as well. I would think is a
more here.
Yeah, probably a little bit more. We would expect that. More tuned into these things. As far as the number of podcasts are concerned, there's quite a lot of podcasts. There's approximately 250,000 podcasts. It's quite a tricky figure to get an exact figure on, but there's estimated about 250,000 products. The UK is catching up with the podcasting field. If you're an independent podcast producer, as we are, sometimes you complain about the BBC. They make a lot of stuff available for download, and they obviously get significant audiences. There's a new Radio 4 series, which is the last episode is appearing this Saturday, which is called In Pod We Trust, which is showing obviously some sort of significance.
It's a terrible name, has to be said.
Yeah. But obviously showing that people are recognising that it is a growing medium.
And if you want to hear that, it's at 10:30 on Radio 4 on Saturday.
And a final little stat, there's 90 million downloads between January and May of this year of podcasts.
From BBC Radio 4. So that's just a bit about what podcasts are. Now we're going to move on to the really interesting bit, which is about why we think you might be interested in podcasting for your business and why it could be good for you and your business. And basically we started off talking about how podcasting had grown in numbers, and that this was really largely driven by the increased accessibility to podcasting for people who are making podcasts, but also more importantly for people who are listening to podcasts. And one of the reasons why we think it's quite a good thing for businesses to be involved in is it looks like this trend is set to continue. We think it's here to stay for the time being, and that it is in fact likely to increase. One of the reasons is that the podcast app that Julian talked about earlier, the Apple one, is now a native app, which means that when you get your new iPhone or iPad, it is there and you can't get rid of it. At least I don't think you can get rid of it at all. So people don't have to be bothered to download it and all that sort of thing. So it is there, so already that sort of helps, doesn't it? And the other thing is that Google Play Music have now become interested in podcasting, which was something a lot of podcasters thought would never happen. Google didn't seem to be that interested in the whole thing. And they have literally just started taking registrations from people who have podcasts and they're going to roll out I don't know quite what it's going to look like, but you're going to be able to get hold of podcasts via Google Play Music. Unfortunately, as with everything Google, they are only taking them from people in the US at the moment, which is highly irritating for people like us when we see all the people in our Facebook groups going, oh, just signed up for Google Play Music and all this sort of thing. But it will no doubt, well, hopefully, will come here as well.
So there's this increased accessibility through the native podcast app, Google Play, Spotify. You can put your podcast on Spotify, online radio networks. The rise of mobile as well, and probably in-car audio is probably the major development. They will be far more available on the latest models of cars. You'll be able to access your podcast fairly easily and listen to what you want to, when you want to, about subjects you want to, basically.
Yeah, Libsyn, who are one of the big podcasting hosting companies, they were saying that in last year they had 2.6 billion podcasts downloaded, and actually 63% of those were requested from mobile devices, and that's obviously going up and up all the time as well. So that's about the sort of demand from listeners, if you like.
But we wanted to also think about what can it actually do for your business. And the first thing I want to say is that I'm sure probably many of you within this room recognise that it's sometimes quite difficult to make your brand stand out from other brands. And I think this is where podcasting can conceivably help that. It can help with three ways, we would say. It can help define your brand. We feel it can help amplify your brand, amplify your message of your brand. And it also, probably most significantly, can help personalise your brand. It helps to humanise it by giving it a voice. It enables you to have some personality, to show your voice behind the brand. And let's face it, probably most of us buy on things like recommendations, on the people we like. Those are the sorts of things which drive that. And podcasting is an amazing facility to be able to do that.
And it's not just about your actual business, it's all about, it can help develop your own personal brand as well, because people can get to see what's behind your business, they get to see you, they get to trust you in a way because they're listening to you a lot, and they get to feel like they really know you, and there's this sort of idea of this horrible word authenticity, which people are always talking about in terms of their business. But I think it does really help to do that, because they do over time get to see the authentic you, or whatever, or at least the one you're pretending to be authentic about. And and basically, of course, people do business with people that they trust.
Anyway, having a podcast can help you create, establish and build credibility, expertise and authority in your industry and amongst your business community. Firstly, obviously, through the content which you put out. Also, obviously, through the guests who you actually interview on your podcast. Through the relationships and the contacts which you make with thought leaders and key people in your industry. It's a fabulous way to give you a gateway to phone somebody up and said, would you be interested in appearing on our podcast? And many, many people will jump at that opportunity to do that. So you're helping to build up your credibility, expertise and authority directly. And I also want to say to some people, because we're not world experts. We have a Changeability podcast. We're not necessarily world experts on everything about change. But you can also gain credibility through association. As you interview large numbers of people, and you'll see this as we go through this presentation, as you interview large numbers of people, you gain that authority through being associated with those people as well. So by the people who you interview as well. So it gives you that gateway in.
And it can sort of help to raise your profile in other ways as well, actually.
Do you want to say about your Shell opportunity? What happened as a result?
Well, there's two things that happened. First of all, the height of our...
Oh, my goodness.
The height of ours was appearing on Radio Suffolk. No, but seriously, because of our podcast, we got asked to go to Radio Suffolk and to talk about what we're doing. They haven't talked to us about the podcast, but also about what we're doing in terms of our business and also about us. So that was quite interesting. We spent the afternoon on Leslie Dolphin's sofa and all that sort of thing. But probably a little bit more impressively, I got an email earlier in the year just completely out of the blue, asking me from a woman who works at Shell, as in Shell, a massive company, apparently the biggest retailer in the world. I never knew that. No. Saying, would I be interested in going to talk at a conference they were putting on? Would I be interested in doing a masterclass on change? Because they were going through a lot of change, and they were putting on a conference called Women in IT for their own staff, for women and men, but obviously a lot of women in the room. And so I said, well, yeah, I think so. If you think I can do it, I'll do it. I'll give it a go. And at some point between when I said I'd do it in April and actually doing it last month in October, I got raised from doing a masterclass to being like the closing keynote, which was alarming. Well, it was alarming when I actually got the agenda, because I saw this agenda and they sent it through, and the opening keynote was Baroness Susan Greenfield. And I'm like, oh wow, she's like this really preeminent scientist.
30 honorary degrees.
Yeah, 30 honorary degrees from honorary doctorates from universities around the world, and then there was me, and I was doing the closing keynote. And in the middle there were all sorts of panels and things like this, and there were 7 vice presidents there. There were 5 from Shell, there was 1 from Microsoft Europe, and there was 1 from Cisco Systems in Europe. And then there was me doing the closing keynote, which was amazing. And the thing is that only came about because of my podcast. This woman had heard our podcast, and then she'd gone out and bought the book and thought that I'd do a good job, which I think they think I did an okay job, hopefully.
And it was at Canary Wharf as well, so
it was
a very
Canary Wharf. It was amazing.
Well,
it was amazing.
So we'd also say that podcasting provides you opportunities to create new networks. We've become a lot more involved in the UK podcasting community, but we've also developed our own communities as well. We've developed a Changeability Facebook group as a result of our podcast, and we attract people using almost like the podcast as a magnet to get people to your site in that sense. We've also become part of other people's networks, or we've tapped into other people's networks with the guests we interview, who will often promote your show. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about Michaela Clark, who's somebody who you interviewed on Podcast Divas.
Yeah, somebody called, we're going to use Michaela Clark as a little bit of a case study today, because Michaela Clark is an Australian lady, and she runs, she has a podcast called the Tradies Business Show podcast in Australia. And tradies are like, that's their name for tradies.
Just say tradies?
Tradies. She kept saying to me, tradies. It's basically tradespeople in Australia, and it's about the business side, as you can gather from that, about being a tradie. And her actual business is she promotes VAs, which are virtual assistants for tradespeople. So because they're all out doing doing the jobs and all this sort of thing, they don't have time to do a lot of the office stuff. So she has a service where they provide people to do that. And her and her co-host, when they started their podcast, set out with a deliberate strategy to interview people on their show that they knew had the listeners they wanted to get to, that had contacts with them. So that's one point. This is her, this is Michaela. There she is. I interview her at episode 6 of Podcast Divas. And basically, I just want to read you a bit of what she said, because what she said was, there's an industry association here that has 80,000 tradespeople on their database. And I don't know if you can read it, but basically what she says is, if she'd rung up, she would never have been able to get to talk to the chairman of this association. But because of the podcast, she's had him as a guest on their show twice. And every time he's on the show, he sends out an email promoting the show to his 80,000 people on his database. So that's 80,000 of the listeners that she wants, and obviously potential customers of hers. Anyway, of course, one of the best reasons for doing a podcast, and we've sort of alluded to some of it, is content marketing. This idea of using the content that you put out there to, in effect, promote your product, your service, whatever it is you do, without actually doing it in an obvious way. It's not actually advertising as such. And obviously, there's masses of opportunity in podcasting to do this. The other thing is, we would say, is that we do think there are a lot of podcasts out there, as we've said, and there are more coming on board at the moment. There's been a little bit of a gold rush sort of to it, but we do think that there is still room for opportunity to get in the game, really. We don't think it's reached saturation.
Just to give you a few little stats here, there's about 200 million blogs out there.
We think.
And I wanted you just to remember back to where you were earlier. You all thought that blogging was an essential part of your business, yeah? We said that there were about 250,000 podcasts, yeah? So there is still quite a lot. So for every 800 blogs, there's one podcast. So that alone is a reason where you can see that there is still considerable room for growth as far as opportunity is concerned.
Now, one of the things about podcasting as well is that once you've got people to listen to you, and okay, that may not be as simple as it sounds, that is part of the challenge of podcasting, but once they've found your podcast and they're listening to what you've got to say, that is a really conscious choice that they're making, because they have to actually subscribe or find it on online or whatever to listen. So the fact that you've got them there, and that is their choice to be there, which gives you even more opportunity in a way to get that message out.
So the listener has chosen to listen to you, in other words.
And if I go back to Michaela, who we were talking about, one of the things, this is thinking about in terms of content marketing, one of the things that they did, her and a co-host on their show, is they actually, one of the main services that their VAs do is to take the phone calls for people, answer the phone for these tradespeople who are out.
Booking appointments.
Yeah, booking appointments, things. And so what they did is they actually they just did a Google search, they found 10 tradies and they phoned them up and they recorded all this for their podcast. And fortunately for them, out of those 10 that they did, 8 of them didn't answer the phone very well at all. The person who answered the phone wasn't what they thought doing a good professional job. 2 of them were. And they actually did this 30-minute episode, and that is what they do. They talk about how you should answer your phone, or ways to answer the phone, and then they gave these as the examples. And they actually bleeped out the names of the companies, so nobody was going to get too upset about it. But actually what she said is that was basically a 30-minute advert for their services, because they were just showing how rubbish most of these people were and how they really needed their service. So that was really just a good example of content marketing.
If we think in terms of podcasting as a medium in itself, it is a very, very intimate medium. One of the things which people often say, we've got somebody who we listen to regularly, and he always starts off his show by saying, "Thank you for allowing me into your earbuds," which is a bit of a horrible phrase, but it does sort of make the case quite well, that it is quite an intimate form of communication with you. People use it in a long form. So if I said to you, for example, you'll see some of our stats later, but I would say if you wanted to have conversations like this with your audience of up to an hour every week, that would probably be a thing which would probably interest quite a lot of you, I suspect, in terms of things. You have that long form ability, and it's better often than blogs and YouTubes. Blogs people tend to skim. YouTube, we know there's easily distracted. You start and then you flick up away from it. But people are using these while they're walking, in the car, commuting, in the gym. So you've really got, and they've chosen to listen to you for that period of time. So it's got a longer attention span than your blog or your YouTube video in that sense.
And the other thing is that some people just like listening, it's just their preferred sort of communication style or their learning style or whatever.
If you're VAK, if you're the A of VAK, visual, auditory or kinesthetic.
So, and obviously, like people like to listen to things online, people who like listening to audible books and things like that. It really suits that type of person. So, what are they listening to? What about the message? The good thing about podcasting is you can be really flexible in how you use it and what message you put out there. There are almost no rules and regulations apart from obviously the law of the country. Like you can't go on there
inciting violence, presumably.
Yeah, you can't be racist or incite violence or anything like that. But apart from that, it's not subject to any of the normal regulations like radio particularly has. And that's why a lot of people, especially comedians and people like that, they love podcasting because they can swear as much that you can swear all the time through your podcast if you want. You just have to mark it as explicit. And I'm not suggesting that you would want to do that, but I'm just saying.
Sorry, ex-army, have to tell you.
So you do have a lot of flexibility in what you do, and it can be a very creative. You can be as creative as you want. Lots of people do interview shows and things like that, but you can also do all sorts of creative things. And basically you can use your podcast to entertain, to inform, to amuse, to educate, or a mixture of all of them, really.
Yeah. On our Changeability podcast, for example, one of the things which is quite difficult is if you're talking about mind management, it's quite difficult to actually go inside somebody's mind. Well, you can very easily in radio. You can put sound effects in it, and you can we give silly audio dramas, which sort of has somebody suddenly inside my brain, and you can actually sort of have a listen to it and what's going on inside it. So you can bring it to life in that sense.
And obviously, storytelling is such a good way to get any message across, and you can do plenty of that. But you can also do things like reporting. You can do straightforward reporting about products or services, or you can review products. It depends on what your business is, really. You can get input from your customers or clients, or you can interview them on there. You can have one-to-one conversations. Really, what you can do on a podcast is endless.
As well as the message, then, we would say that it's also about increasing your reach. This doesn't necessarily have to be just, in terms of podcasting, just a numbers game. It depends on the business which you're actually operating, and also the niche which you're in as well. But so it can also be thought about in terms of the right audience, the people who are choosing to listen to you, as we said. Having said that, podcasting can be a really great way to expand and find a new audience. If we talk numbers, let's give you probably the worst number, if you like. The average number of downloads for a podcast is 179.
A month.
Our total for the Changeability podcast in the 15 months we've been going is 141,595 as of yesterday, giving us an average of about 9,400 40 to 50-minute conversations with people while we're asleep. People are putting across the changeability message, us in hyperspace. So it's really useful.
We get about 9,000 a month.
And if you compare that, for example, with our blog, that's probably about 3 or 4 times what we've achieved from our blog. So it's quite useful from that. Imagine that number of people who you were talking to on a daily basis, a weekly basis, or a monthly basis. You'd probably, I suspect, if you're like us, be quite grateful to be talking to a group of people as large as this, but you're doing that day in, day out. Literally, so from that point of view.
I mean, our numbers are quite good compared to a lot of podcasts, it has to be said. There are a lot of podcasts who have a lot less than us. We don't want to be unrealistic about the numbers. But there are also some that have a lot more, particularly in the United States, it has to be said, they've got a massive, much bigger audience.
Let's just have a quick look at ours, conscious of the time. There's a map of the world, and you can see anything which is darker green, so you can see Britain and the UK in particular. This is our audience here, just to give you some sort of idea. We've got 51% in the UK, 8.46% in the United Arab Emirates. We have no idea why we've got that, but we have 15% in the United States, and that transfers into rough numbers, 71,000 in the UK, 21,000 in the US. We're actually listened to in 146 countries. We're not listened to in North Korea, not yet anyway. So it's quite interesting to do that.
It's amazing, isn't it? And some of those countries will only have, handful of people.
And this is a couple of people broadcasting or podcasting from their room in their own home to 146
Our little house
countries.
in Woodbridge. There we are. So the other thing about what we've been talking about, podcasting is like, we're talking to people a lot of the time. You're getting your message across, but it is actually quite a good communication channel, backward and forth, which you might not necessarily think of straight away. And it can provide a feedback loop. There are feedback mechanisms in there for you. It gives you an opportunity for your audience to let you know feedback about your podcast or about your products or whatever, and you can also feedback to them. You can also involve your audience. There are some shows which are literally totally audience generated. So people will write in a question. There's 2 business shows which you may or may not be aware of. One's called Ask Gary, which is with Gary Vaynerchuk, and one called Ask Pat, which is with Pat Flynn of Smart Passive Income. And basically, people just send them a question, they answer a question every day on their podcast. And it's very interesting for other people because it's the sort of questions probably that a lot of businesses would be wanting to do.
And helps you to get a really good understanding of your target audience as well, in that sense.
Yeah, the people listening to you. And the other way in which you can find out what your audience thinks is through the reviews they leave. And we won't go into these, but these are just some of the reviews. I think we've got about 78, 79 reviews. About 45 of them are from the UK. And
but you can see some of the
these
things
are on
about,
iTunes, by the
about
way.
developing your own personal brand. I feel like we've made 2 new friends with Catherine and Julian. That's a phenomenal privilege to actually get that from a group of people who are writing in off their own bat, to actually mention some of those things to you. So
We don't actually know these people. They're not our relatives or anything. I do have to say that.
You know, even differentiating us from an American-style market, you can see that mentioned on that one. This is as far as you can get from American-style
That was
BS.
pleasing because that's one of the things we really wanted to do.
So just to give you an overview.
That's just an idea. So you do get feedback.
Now, for many of you, I'm sure if you're thinking about podcasting or in terms of your own business, you're probably interested in the concept. The pinnacle is around about monetization. The bottom line, if we're honest with you, is it's actually quite difficult to quantify what money you make from podcasting. But do not be necessarily put off by that. There is some form of direct monetization if you reach a certain heady heights, so you can achieve sponsorship for your podcast depending on your numbers and your niche. They operate basically a radio advertising model. So if you're getting about 8,000 episode downloads in 6 weeks, you are likely to be in a position where you might be able to attract some form of sponsorship. But don't be put off by that. You can also sponsor yourself. You can promote your own business. Obviously, you can't just say, make it one whole advert, or otherwise people won't. It's about content marketing. But you can promote your own business, for example. That's what we do on the Changeability podcast periodically.
Yeah, if you listen to us, we always say, don't we? We always start off by saying, Changeability podcast brought to you by brilliantlivingHQ.com and Mind Management for your
And your
best
book
life
went to
business.
#1, didn't it, in Amazon? And that's, we think, in part down
Not
to...
in the whole of Amazon, I have to say.
No.
In my category
Your
in
category.
Amazon. In personal transformation, yeah.
So
it does help.
often people use podcasts as a medium to get people back to their website. So they will traditionally put the show notes together of what's being spoken about and any links, affiliate links within that, and you then promote that so people come back to your website and then hopefully engage more with your website as a result of that.
There's another thing you can do, which is if you have guests on, you can, depending on your business and whether it's suitable, of course, you can have sort of joint venture things going, or partnership working going on as well, which is another way in which you can generate sales or income. And
Can I just quickly mention about the lead capture and lead magnet, because I think that is incredibly important. We're still in the infancy of this, but what we're doing is we're beginning to use our podcast as a lead magnet, as a way of capturing people to get them to come to our website. So one of the things we're beginning to do, we haven't fully developed at the moment, we're going to have a funnel, a sales funnel, which will come, so people will come back to our podcast with the offer of a lead magnet of downloading the Changeability Starter Kit, which we've actually launched already. So they then go through this sequence of emails, which then goes on to a main product offering and a sub-product offering as a result of that. And we'll show you in a minute some people who've put that into incredibly good use.
there's a couple of people, James Schramko and Amy Porterfield, who both have popular podcasts, business podcasts, and what both of them do is they do a summary of the main points of what their show is about that people can then go into their website and download, and that's how they're capturing their emails. The other thing is, I talked earlier about the opportunities that come from joint working, and going back to Michaela Clark, Julian has mentioned it a little bit, but what she said was, if you listen to the podcast you'll hear it, but she was looking for working with other people and partnerships and what have you. And she said, we've certainly had some really exciting partnership and reselling opportunities come through the podcast. I woke up one morning to an email saying, yes, this partner wants to go ahead, and it's worth 7 to 8 figures for the business. One phone call alone can make all the difference to our life and business by having the podcast. It's very exciting. That's
we were
what she
actually
said.
around with her when she went from that situation. She'd put in this bid, and then she came to this conference where we got to know her, and we found out during the course of it, near the end of it, didn't we, that she'd suddenly signed. She said, basically, I've become a millionaire through her, and she really did put it down to her podcast.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the thing which is going to happen, but what we want to do is to give you a vision of a possibility, a vision of opportunity,
Yeah,
right? And just in case you sort of think, well, is there money in this? Just to give you a few people that you've probably heard of these people along the way. Pat Flynn of Smart.
Does anybody here listen to Pat Flynn, his Smart Passive Income. It sounds hideous, and it's Smart Passive Income. It sounds really sort of cheesy and everything, but he is brilliant and
He's
well
fantastic.
worth
It's
looking at.
definitely worth
We've got a
listening
list of a few podcasts in a
But
minute.
quite a lot in America go into the slightly brash way of saying how much income they've done, and you can drill down and find out exactly where they've earned their money. You can see here $120,217.75 last month.
Now, what I would say about him is that he doesn't just have a podcast, but he does say that his podcast is his main way of getting people to. It's what his podcast has grown. Since he had his podcast, his business has grown a lot more. He obviously makes most of his money off affiliate actually work, and now some other stuff that he's got going on. But that's just interesting.
Teaching he does as well, doesn't he?
I hate this, by the way. I hate this putting your money on your podcast. It's so American, and we know Pat Flynn always said to him, you just wouldn't feel right doing that. It's just so un-British, isn't it, putting your money out there? But it's really interesting, on the other hand, seeing, and he does a report every month of exactly where that money comes from. But that is small fry compared to this next person.
John Lee Dumas,
hold on.
who is from Entrepreneur on Fire. You can see his income last month, £542,658.
Dollars.
Dollars.
Yeah, now this one is really interesting. And of course, these are way out there, and he is way out there. This was up like $250,000 on its previous month, because they just closed their membership site and they had a big push, so it was unusually high. And once again, it all started with this podcast called Entrepreneur on Fire. Has anyone heard of this or listened to this?
Wow, that's amazing. Nobody's heard of that. That's fantastic. That is great though, 'cause like where the circles we travel, like everybody will know these two names, and these are so useful to you if you're interested in internet marketing. They are incredibly
one of the things
useful
that's
sites.
interesting about Johnny Dumas, he was the first person to do a daily podcast, like a business daily podcast. People said, "Oh, you can't do that." That was nearly 3 years ago. He started, and he's still going. The podcast was where it all started, but from that, I'm not saying he gets all his money from his podcast, because he doesn't, and he breaks it down and he'll tell you how much he gets from his sponsorship and all that. But since then, they've done membership sites, they do webinars, courses, and all sorts of things that have come off there. And in fact, it's him and his partner Kate Erickson who run Entrepreneur on Fire. And Kate Erickson is my guest on my podcast this week.
Just told you we mentioned that.
Just to let you know.
Okay,
it's not out yet, but it will be in a day or two.
So maybe we need to go a little bit simpler in terms of certain things after what we just heard about, maybe you're not hearing about. You can use podcasting as a phenomenal resource. I almost defy you not to get interested in something from podcasting once you actually start searching about it. So here's some really, really good podcasts. We could perhaps make these available, Sam, and you can then send those out. But there's some ones which we like: Smart Passive Income podcast, Pat Flynn; Online Marketing Made Easy, Amy Porterfield; Youpreneur, Chris Ducker; Super Fast Business. That guy, James Schramko, is so sharp on business. If you want to listen to somebody who's really making it big in the internet space, these are people who would be good names to have a listen
And then
to.
there's Michaela's one that I was just put that on there so you can see it. Right, so we just want to finish off with a few slides about the how of podcasting. So we're going to give you a really brief overview on the things we think it would be good to think about if you're interested in getting started. We could talk all day about this, obviously, so we're not going to, but it'll give you a few pointers, hopefully.
So the first of all is often what people think about first is about the equipment. Do I need loads of equipment? Well, you need some equipment, but you don't need loads of equipment. And it's not necessarily the first thing which you need to think about when actually you think about podcasting. We'll go on to some starter questions in a moment, but it's often what many people get focus on and get waylaid on at various stages. Basically, the basics you need is you can podcast really on any sort of budget, but there are things like audio quality which you want to try and ensure you get better over a period of time. You need a microphone, a computer, an iPad, or you can even do a podcast on an iPhone, a computer, and maybe some recording or editing software. You can get that for free off the internet, so you don't even need to pay for that. So you can start on literally next to nothing. I put up that MacBook Pro up there just to show you that there's a woman who you interviewed recently called Sarah Williams, and she has a podcast called the Tough Girl Podcast. and that's all she uses for her podcast. She does her editing on it, she does her recording on it, she does, so basically that's...
She doesn't even have a mic, she just uses the microphone on that. We wouldn't recommend that actually, but you can do it.
Yeah, you can do it. And a mixer obviously will help you to actually get the different levels, particularly if, like with us, we've got two voices. Perhaps as a male voice, mine's perhaps, I don't know, slightly louder maybe than Catherine's, so maybe you can just mix the levels a little bit in terms of that.
So that's just a quick thing about, we could talk about equipment for a long time or what have you, but before you actually get to the equipment stage, there are actually some more basic things really that you should be asking yourself. So here are some...
Our starter for 10.
Quick starter
No, it's not
questions.
10.
The first one, is podcasting right for me and my business? And by this we mean, because we can get carried away and talk about anything, but is it actually for you? And only you can answer that, but what I would say is please be realistic about it, because it is a commitment. Doing a podcast is quite a big commitment in terms of the resources that you need to give to it. The main one actually being time, to be honest. Yes. We do a weekly podcast. At the moment I'm doing 2 weekly podcasts, and it does take up a lot of time. Partly depends on your format and all that sort of thing. And there's this thing called pod fade that people talk about, and that normally happens around 7 episodes, and that's like the average time in which people who are not going to keep going, they start trailing off there. So there are a few things you can do around that, but just be realistic about what it takes.
The next thing you might want to think about is, what is your podcast for? What is the outcome you want from your podcast? What is the point of it? Is it to promote you? We said it's good for your business. It can also be good for you as an individual as well. So is it to promote you? Is it to educate your audience? Is it to raise awareness of your brand? Or is it to establish or increase credibility and expertise in your field? Or reaching new customers and clients? So think fairly carefully about the reasons why you're going into creating the podcast. What is your podcast for?
Also, the other thing is, we're talking about it here from a business point of view, but obviously you can have a podcast for anything. Loads of people are doing podcasts for their hobby and for fun, or to promote a cause that they believe in and stuff. So it could be for all those things as well, and it can be really good fun as well. You don't want to sound so serious. And of course you need to think about your audience. It's like any business thing, isn't it? Who's your avatar, that lovely word? Who's your ideal listener? Who are they? Where are they? Might they be listening to you? What is it that you think they want to know from you? What sort of value can you bring to them? And then that brings us on to the actual show yourself. There are some basic questions that you need to think about if you're thinking about doing a show.
So you know what you want your podcast to achieve. You know your ideal audience. The next thing, now it's time to think about what message of your show and what your show will look at. So the first thing you think about is what type of show you're going to be doing. Are you going to be doing a solo show, a co-host show? Now, that has some advantages. Often you can share that. You have different areas of expertise which you can bring. Is it going to be an interview style, a magazine style, a round table? We were speaking to somebody when we were here last who was working for Adnams, and he set up a podcast for Adnams, and it was phenomenally popular, he said, didn't he?
It was Sean Clark. He was talking last time. He has a podcast, and but when he has his own podcast,
and he used to go out with the Adnams guys
Adnams.
On a Friday. They'd go out for a meal. He'd put the mic in with his 2 experts from Adnams. They'd talk. He'd put it out as a podcast, and it literally went out almost unedited in that format. So that might be quite something which would be quite useful. What format should your show take? I'm sure you probably are aware in terms of radio that some structure to your show is useful. Likewise with a podcast, it's useful to have some sort of format. You might have the same sections each week. Some people even operate with the same questions, although I don't personally like that particularly. But
John Lee Dumas
asks the same questions. He's now on about episode 300, or you can mix it up a little bit. The length, you might want to think about a set length. The frequency of it, is it weekly or monthly, fortnightly? A popular thing now is to give you some break time, because it is quite a commitment, is to do things in terms of series. So you might do a series which specifically looks, as we did with the Changeability podcast initially, for the launch of a particular product. And you're doing content marketing around that, and then you're almost bringing people to a conclusion with that. You then stop, you take a short break, and then you may look again. That has some other advantages, that you introduce a new series and you have the opportunity once again to get higher in new and noteworthy on iTunes again, which is what we were talking about at the very, very beginning of it.
And you can just do a standalone series. You could literally just do like 10 or 12 episodes and put it out there, and it's sort of a contained thing. Right, so now you decided you're going to do your podcast. What are the ways of actually producing it? So we've just broken this down into 3 basic models. The first one is the DIY, where you do everything, the do-it-yourself model, which is what we do and how a lot of people started off. So, you produce the whole show, you create your script or your bullet points or however you want to do it. You find your guests if it's an interview show. You reach out to them, you do all the email to and fro and all that sort of thing. You invite them. You host the show yourself. You edit the show once you've recorded it. You tag it, because you have to tag all your shows to
so
put
it's
them.
more visible.
You upload it. You upload it to your podcast host. Now, you don't have to have a podcast host. You can just host your podcast on your website, but that's generally not so.
I don't really know of anybody who really does that, because basically what happens if you host your podcast on your site, you take up a lot of bandwidth. So if you've got a lot of people trying to download your podcast, it brings your website to a standstill. So most people host on an external provider, the main one being Libsyn is probably
that's who we use, standing for Liberated Syndication. And basically you just upload it onto there, and then
once you've set it up, you have a thing called an RSS feed, which I'm sure you probably know from your blogs, and iTunes just checks that RSS feed, and every time you put a new episode on, it says, oh, there's a new episode on there, and it puts it onto iTunes. So once you set it up, you don't need to do anything in relation.
And then obviously you could do things like you produce your own show notes, your own artwork to go with your show notes, and you promote your own episode on social media and maybe on your email. So that's the do it yourself version. Then there's the done with you version, where you would probably do most of the first bits of what we talked about there. So you'd do the script and all that stuff that we talked about, but you may well then outsource.
So you've recorded it as
You've
well.
recorded it, you've recorded it, and then you put it in Dropbox or whatever, and somebody else would actually edit it for you and do a lot of those other bits, the tagging and the uploading to the host and all that sort of thing. So that's a bit of a mixture of a model.
I just want to mention that idea of commitment, because it is a big commitment. When I started fresh-faced 69 episodes, I used to love all doing the editing. The 69th episode and you're still doing the same thing, it can wear a little bit, yeah? So you may wish to think about where you move in terms of your model, and these are sort of variations which you can do. So some of it you're doing, and hopefully other bits. I mentioned that chap James Schramko. He literally records it. The next thing he does, he drags it into Dropbox, and everything else is done for him from that.
And he also
repurposes
everything. So someone else takes it and makes a video out of it. Someone else
social
takes
media.
it and does his social media. Someone else takes it and does a blog post out of it.
Show notes.
He does everything. He's got a massive virtual team of, I don't know, 20
So that
assistants
probably
or
leads to that
something.
last one, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
this is it.
Which is,
It's on there.
sorry, I'm sorry.
I've got more
Oh
to do
my
now.
goodness.
It's all
Oh
about
my
that.
goodness. There we go. Done
Yeah,
for you.
so there are companies that will do this for you. There's quite a lot of companies out there that will do it for you, especially the editing and things like that. And the other thing is you can obviously also get maybe people nearer to home to do it, like we're thinking of maybe looking for a nice student or someone to come and help us do some of this, because it's a great skill to have as well. And there are some companies that will do everything. They'll do your show notes and do your social media messages, and literally you would just get it back, and then you just have to upload these things onto your, or however you do your social media, whatever automated system you use or whatever. So you can do any, a mixture of all of these are out there for you if you're interested in that sort of thing. And certainly, if you want to talk to us about any of these things that we've talked about, you've got our details in a minute. We'd be very, very happy to talk to you. And if you're interested in us wanting to actually help you get started, we can also do that with you, depending on what it is you want.
And you'll be very pleased to hear that's it.
I just wanted to say one other thing, because we did have.
That isn't it.
We did this thing, we did a little meetup with something we call Suffolk Podcasters that we just tried out. We just put something up, and there were 3 of us there. it's not a presentation or anything. It's just literally for people to sit around, have a drink, and talk about podcasting or different ideas they've got.
Or aspirations to become podcasters.
And we're thinking of starting it again after Christmas in the new year sometime. So if anyone is interested, we're going to have this is our contact details there, lots of them. Just send us an email and we'll get a little list together if people are interested, and then get back to you if you are going to do anything. So I think that's just about it. Thank you so much for being so patient and listening to us, and happy to take any questions if anyone's got any.